When my oldest son was about 14, he told me he aspired to be a polymath. And I said, okay, you want to be good at a lot of types of math? And he looked at me kind of blankly and said, no, Mom, I want to be good at everything. So I pulled out Google, and there it was, polymath, a person of wide-ranging knowledge or learning. When I first read the book, Einstein's Dreams, about 4 years ago, I marveled at the beauty of the prose intertwined with the intricacies of Einstein's theories of time and relativity. Who wrote this? I thought to myself. So I turned to the author's description, and it said, Dr. Alan Lightman, physicist, writer, social entrepreneur, served on the faculties of Harvard and MIT, one of the first persons at MIT to hold joint faculty positions in both the sciences and the humanities. Aha, a polymath. Dr. Lightman recently hosted a PBS 3-part miniseries on searching for meaning in the age of science, examining the complex interaction of human spirituality with mankind's continued leaps forward scientifically. Join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Lightman to our stage this evening.
Oops. Just had a wardrobe failure here. Well, it's very nice to be here in this beautiful space, and I know I've got some friends in the audience, and thank you everybody for coming. And I want to thank David Kaufman for inviting me to Freeport Speech. My talk tonight will be partly based on my book, Searching for Stars on an Island in Maine. I'm also going to show some clips from a recent PBS series that I was involved with. It's titled Searching Our Quest for Meaning in the Age of Science. It premiered a little over a year ago. And after working on that series for about a year, I realized that I'm a better writer than a TV personality, but I did learn a lot from working on it. And I want to apologize in advance for the beginning and endings of the video clips I'm going to show you. I did not have a professional film editing program and had to trim clips from the 3 hours of the series myself. So there'll be a few seconds at the beginning and ending of each clip. They're not quite right, but I don't think it's too bad. My book, Searching for Stars on an Island in Maine, is really a sort of like an extended meditation as I wonder about this island, not too far from here. And I've been spending the last 30 summers or so there with my wife and children and now grandchildren. And my talk is going to have that a little bit of a rambling feeling as well. So I'm going to start with a clip from the television series. This is the first scene of the first episode of the series, and it sort of raises all of the big questions. My name is Alan Lightman. I'm a scientist and a writer. My family has a home on a small island in Maine. The island has no roads or bridges, and there's no ferry service. One summer night in the wee hours, I was coming back to the island in my boat. I was alone on the water. I was captivated by the quiet and the stars overhead. I decided to turn off the engine. I lay down in the boat and looked up. After a few moments, my world dissolved into that star-littered sky. The boat disappeared, my body disappeared, and I found myself falling into infinity. I felt as if I were part of the stars. I was merging with something much larger than myself. And the vast expanse of time, extending from the far distant past, long before I was born, and then into the far distant future, long after I'll be gone, seemed compressed to a dot. What was happening to me? As a scientist, I used to think that everything could be reduced to numbers. But at that moment in the boat, I believe you could have hooked up every neuron in my brain to a giant computer, and all of that data wouldn't have come close to explaining my experience. After a time, I sat up and started the engine again. And so began my personal journey to understand how these different worlds relate. The world of atoms and molecules, and the world of complex human experiences. In a material and impermanent cosmos in the age of science, what is it that has meaning? And how can we find it? My quest would lead me to the laboratories of Nobel Prize-winning scientists, to conversations with philosophers and ethicists, and even to the private chapel of the Dalai Lama. I've worked as a physicist for many years, and I've always held a purely scientific view of the world. And by that I mean I think the world is made of just atoms and molecules and nothing more, and those atoms and molecules obey laws that we can discover. Even at the age of 12 or 13, I was impressed by the logic and materiality of the world. I built my own homemade laboratory, and among other projects, I began making pendulums by tying a fishing weight to the end of a string. I think I'd read in Popular Science or some other magazine that the time for a pendulum to make a complete swing was proportional to the square root of the length of the pendulum. And with the help of a stopwatch and a ruler, I verified this wonderful law. Logic and pattern, cause and effect. As far as I could tell, everything was subject to scientific analysis and test, and I didn't see any reason to believe in the supernatural. And that's still pretty much my view. But after that experience in the boat in Maine, I understood the attraction of what I'll call the spiritual world. I understood the allure of non-material and ethereal things that are all-encompassing, even sacred, things and experiences that are not reducible to logical analysis. But at the same time, and maybe paradoxically, I remain a scientist. I remain committed to the material world. And in recent years, I've begun thinking of myself as what I'll call a spiritual materialist. And by materialist, I don't mean that I buy Rolls Royces or stuff my closets with Armani suits. I mean materialist literally, that the physical world is made of material, atoms and molecules, and that's it. But I've also had amazing transcendent experiences, such as feelings of being connected to something larger than myself, like when I lay down in the boat and looked up at the stars. Feeling of connections with other people, feeling of connections to nature, the appreciation of beauty, awe, falling in love. These are all my versions of spirituality, so that's why I call myself a spiritual materialist. And in the next clip I'm going to show you, I try to get a scientific understanding of that transcendent experience I had lying in the boat. What does it mean that our world is just material and that everything follows the laws of cause and effect? Is the world just one giant clock? Wind it up and it ticks away, one cog linking to another? As a scientist, I don't believe there's anything outside the material world or any supernatural forces. But what about our consciousness, our thoughts, our paintings and our symphonies, our falling in love? Could all of that come from mere material, mechanically following the laws of cause and effect? And if everything is material, could neuroscience explain my Starry Night experience? I recently had a brain scan, and I was looking at this image, which is like what I saw that night in the boat.
Okay.
And can you show me what my brain was doing?
What you are seeing in these areas that are shown in bright orange and yellow, this is the part of your brain that was active when you were staring up at the stars.
What can you tell me about that experience that I was having by looking at that picture? That's what I want to know.
It tells me that, first of all, you are not using the problem-solving parts of your brain.
So you can tell that I was reflecting by looking at this picture. Can you tell what I was reflecting on?
No. That's beyond our capability right now, is to get the exact content of your self-reflection.
In addition to the fMRI, I was scanned in the MEG. Magnetoencephalography reveals the millisecond by millisecond changes in electrical flows in the brain.
So with the MEG, now you're getting this very fine temporal time course, and you can see the activity is changing rapidly. You know, as you're having different thoughts at different moments in time.
But when I was lying in the boat, looking up at the stars, it didn't seem to me like things were happening rapidly. In fact, I didn't have any sense of time at all. I just felt this overpowering connectedness. Is there any way that I could see that in these blips here?
You may have felt that there wasn't a lot of activity going on in your brain, but I think that's the illusion.
Well, I have to confess that even though I'm a scientist and a materialist, somehow seeing these wiggles, it doesn't satisfy me that that has captured the experience that I had lying in the boat looking up at the stars. And maybe I'm just a romantic, but it doesn't feel fully. That's an example where I cut it off just a hair or two soon. But I think you get the idea. So for thousands of years, we human beings have been torn between the material and the immaterial. Modern science has shown us that all things in the material world are impermanent and ultimately pass away. Even atoms, which were thought to be indivisible and indestructible, can be split. Stars, once thought to be eternal and even sacred, we now know eventually use up their nuclear fuel and burn out. Even our entire universe, which was once thought to be the ultimate and largest unity possible, is considered by some physicists to be just one of many universes, many of which don't have the right or may not have the right conditions for life. And yet, we long for something that is eternal, some essence that is not material. Part of us wants to reduce everything to atoms and molecules governed by logic and laws, and ultimately pass away. And part of us wants to resist that temptation, wants to believe that some things are eternal, that some things are not reducible to zeros and ones. So there's this tension, which I think has been the source of our science on one hand and our religion on the other. This tension comes into discussions of free will versus determinism, I think art and aesthetics, and questions of ethics and moral behavior. It's related to the definitions and boundaries of science. So it's an essential tension in us human beings. For me, the human body is the most amazing and tantalizing and baffling phenomena of the material world. Some years ago, I had a colonoscopy without using a full anesthetic, and I was able to watch on a computer screen the shifting views of the insides of my colon. And I was dismayed. There, revealed in digital detail, was the deep interior of my body, a realm that I had always considered as mysterious, a forbidden temple, fragile, secretive as it went about its profound business of keeping me alive. And surely that mystical place was separate from the world of tables and chairs. But here it was with no illusions. I was shocked to see ordinary flesh. I was shocked to see gelatinous membranes like quivering jelly, whitish in color, with bumps and ridges and turns. I felt like a trespasser in my own body. Apparently, my colon was just material stuff, and I'm just material stuff. I know this intellectually, but I don't like the idea. I recoil from it. In recent years, I've gotten to know a prominent Buddhist monk in Cambodia by the name of Yos Hut Kemakero, and his friends call him Kema. Here's a picture of Kema. After the devastation of the Khmer Rouge genocide in the mid-1970s, in which monks were targeted along with all educated people, Kema played a major role in rebuilding the Buddhist monkhood in Cambodia. And I visited him one warm day in January at Wat Lang A, which is his monastery. It's on a busy street in Phnom Penh. And I was hoping that he might help me understand this communion I had with the stars that summer night in Maine, and other experiences that I didn't really understand. Wat Lang A is a large temple complex. It contains several pagodas, patios, and walkways, and it has living quarters for a couple of hundred monks. And it has a magnificent gate in the front. Let me see. Is that bright enough, or can I make it brighter? I guess it's bright enough. This gate rises 40 feet high, and it has lions on both sides, so it's sort of guard the entrance. And so you're on a busy street with cars and motos, that's the name for the small motorcycles everybody rides, shouting of street sellers. But as soon as you walk into that gate, you have a sense of serenity. And slowly, I walked past the gold leaf pagodas, I passed the stupas and the scattered stone pots filled with red and pink bougainvillea. I walked through courtyards with young men in orange robes quietly talking to each other. And eventually I came to Kimma's personal living quarters in the back, which was a tiny house. We sat under some trees, and there was a faint smell of jasmine in the air. And under the trees, Kimma and I began discussing modern physics and cosmology. And he said to me, Buddhism is in complete agreement with science. And then he smiled and said, science just puts in the details. Kimma explained to me the Buddhist belief that the universe has gone through an infinite number of cycles in the past and will go through an infinite number of cycles in the future. And then I mentioned to him that modern cosmologists have evidence that the universe will continue expanding forever without going through any cycles. And he laughed. And perhaps he thought it was preposterous that science could know such a thing. Or perhaps he thought it was delightful that science could know such a thing. And I asked Kimma how Buddhists know that the universe has already gone through an infinite number of cycles. And he said that knowledge comes from the Buddha himself, one of whose names is the Lakavidu, which means, I think it's in Pali, the knower of worlds. The Buddha knew everything, said Kimma. And he took out a pen and scribbled down some books that I should read. And I thought to myself, how do we know that the Buddha was the knower of worlds? Were Einstein and Darwin also knowers of worlds? And the truths and laws that we believe about the world, why do we believe them, and on what authority? Well, science and religion differ profoundly in the way that truths are discovered. In religion and theology, these truths and beliefs seem to have two origins. One origin is the sacred books, like the Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, the Pali Canon. And believers have faith that these books contain the true word of God or other enlightened beings. And so the authority of the teachings derives from the infinite wisdom of these beings. The second origin of religious and spiritual truth is more personal, what I call the transcendent experience. And I want to talk briefly about these two kinds of knowledge and religion and spirituality, and then compare them to the kinds of knowledge and methods of science. Quotations from the sacred books are used to declare truths ranging everywhere from the origin of the universe to proper moral behavior to reproductive biology. And even today, there are many religious thinkers who attribute absolute authority and truth to the teachings of the sacred books, and some people call this divine revelation. And I completely respect the notions of God and other divine beings. However, I do insist on one thing. I insist that any statements about the material world, whether they're in the sacred books or not, they have to be subject to experimental testing of science. They can't be assumed. I think the material world is the province of science. In the physical world, the material world, the laws of science can't apply to some phenomena and not to others, or at some times and not other times. It's not okay with me if the principles of aerodynamics work on some of my airplane flights, but not others. So let me turn now to the transcendent experience. And for me, as both a scientist and a humanist, the transcendent experience is the most powerful evidence we have for what I'll call a spiritual world. By transcendent experience, I mean the immediate and vital personal experience of being connected to something larger than ourselves. And by the spiritual world, I mean the totality of all of these experiences, such as feelings of connection to nature, the appreciation of beauty, the connections to other people. The experience I had lying in the boat looking up at the stars that night in Maine was a transcendent experience. And I've had others, and I imagine everybody in this room has had transcendent experiences. The transcendent experience may or may not involve a supreme being or God. And unlike the received wisdom from the sacred books or the pronouncements of religious institutions, the transcendent experience is intensely personal, and the authority of that experience and the understandings gained from it rest in the experience itself. No other person can deny the validity of what you have felt in a transcendent experience. The feelings cannot be disproved, and I think that every transcendent experience is a unique event. Another transcendent experience that I've had is communion with wild animals, and I'm sure some of you have had that experience as well. And I want to reenact that experience that I had in the next clip. This clip is going to begin with a conversation with a Nobel Prize-winning biologist named Jack Szostak. And Szostak has been working in his laboratory with his colleagues to create a living cell from scratch, just from the primitive chemicals, the chemicals present in primitive Earth. And so in this clip, Szostak is going to discuss his view of the origin of life, and then he says that we human beings are part of nature, and then we go to my communion with the wild animal. So that's all in this next clip. Life is totally natural.
If we can show that there is a kind of continuous pathway of straightforward steps that connects chemistry, the environments of a young planet, to the emergence of biology, then I think it would be logical to just accept life as another natural phenomenon. I mean, it's no less wonderful or beautiful because we understand that there's a natural origin for it. And so understanding how we're a product of nature right from the beginning, I think builds on that view that we're not something separate and different, but we're a part of nature. And we should accept that and live with that.
A few years ago, I had an astonishing reminder of our oneness with nature. It happened on that little island in Maine. There's an osprey's nest about 100 feet from our house. Every year, the same pair of birds returns to the nest and starts a new family. First, they gather materials to repair the damage done by the winter storms. In April, the mother osprey lays eggs. In early June, the chicks hatch. Father osprey uses his speed and sharp talons to catch fish to feed the growing family. And by August, the baby ospreys are now juveniles and almost as big as their parents. They're strong enough to take their first flight, their maiden voyage away from the nest. One summer, a few years back, on a sunny August afternoon, the juvenile of that season took flight for the first time. I've been watching this baby bird getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and she was watching me. And probably to her, it looked like I was in my nest. On this particular day, her maiden flight, she did one loop around the island and then headed straight towards me at what seemed like the speed of an F-15. My first instinct was to run back into the house, but something kept me standing there. Something magical happened. For about a half second, we made eye contact, and just in that split second, there was so much that was conveyed between us. Then she suddenly made a dazzling climb and veered up and away over the house. What was exchanged between us in that moment? To me, it was a look of connectedness, of mutual respect. I felt like that bird was telling me, we're kindred spirits. We've shared this land together. Life in our universe is a flash in the pan, a few moments in the vast unfolding of time and space. But a realization of the scarcity of life makes me feel some profound connection to other living things. Our lives may be flickers, but some experiences endure. Atoms transcending atoms, the miraculous and the material. I want to discuss now the knowledge of science and the methods of science and contrast that with the knowledge of religion. Scientific knowledge is of two types. The first type is knowledge of the properties of physical objects, like the size and the mass of a raindrop. And the second is knowledge of what we call the laws of nature. One of the first human beings to formulate a law of nature was the ancient Greek Archimedes more than 2,000 years ago. And here is his law of floating bodies. Any solid lighter than a fluid, and he means less dense than a fluid, will, if placed in the fluid, be so far immersed, submerged, that the weight of the fluid displaced will equal the weight of the solid. And we can speculate on how Archimedes arrived at this law. At the time in ancient Greece, there were certainly scales for weighing goods in the market. The scientist would have first weighed an object, and then he would have placed it in a rectangular container of water and measured the rise and height of the water. So if you multiply that rise and height by the area of the container, you get the volume of the water displaced. And finally, he could take that same volume of water and put it back on the scale and weigh it. And undoubtedly, he would have performed this exercise many times with different objects before devising his law. And he probably also performed the experiment with some different liquids like mercury as well as water to discover the generality of the law. And all of the laws of the physical world are like Archimedes' law. They're precise, most of them are quantitative, and they're general, applying to a large range of phenomena. In the last couple of hundred years, we've discovered laws that govern the behavior of electricity and magnetism, the forces inside atoms, the structure of DNA, the expansion of the universe, and many other phenomena. And from those laws, we've been able to explain in quantitative detail everything from the color of the sky to the orbits of planets to the six-sided symmetry of snowflakes. And we've seen no evidence to contradict the notion that all phenomena in the physical world are governed by laws, that the universe is lawful. And let me tell you a little bit about how science progresses. The law for pendulums that I verified as a child was first discovered by the Italian physicist Galileo in about the year 1600. Galileo's law was later found to be a special case of Isaac Newton's more General Laws of Motion and Gravity, published in 1686. There's a picture of Isaac with his law of gravity there, and you don't have to go home and work out that equation. For 2 centuries, Newton's law worked beautifully. But in the mid-19th century, with increased precision of telescopes and very careful measurements, astronomers concluded that the orbit of the planet Mercury didn't quite match the predictions of Newton's law. And the accumulated discrepancy was really, really small, about 1/100th of 1 angular degree every century. Very, very tiny, but Newton's law was so precise, and the measurements of Mercury were so precise, that some scientists were troubled. And then in 1915, Albert Einstein proposed a new theory of gravity replacing Newton's theory called general relativity. Einstein's theory explained perfectly the orbit of Mercury, and it predicted many new phenomena like black holes. And now I want to emphasize the main point. Despite its enormous success, we know that Einstein's theory will also need revision because it doesn't include quantum physics. All the laws of nature discovered by scientists are considered provisional. They're considered to be approximations to deeper laws, and they're constantly revised as new experimental evidence is discovered or new and testable ideas are proposed. And it's in the process of revision that we see the strongest differences between the methods and beliefs of science and those of religion. Everything we know about the physical world, which is the domain of science, is subject to revision. Everything has to be tested and proved. But the knowledge of religion, coming from either the divine authority of the sacred books or from the personal transcendent experience, is not really subject to revision. It's not an approximation. It's considered to be certain. And it's a bit of a paradox that all of the knowledge of religion is considered certain, and all the knowledge of science is considered uncertain. But still, science has done pretty well with its approximations and uncertainties. They've been good enough to give us antibiotics and smartphones and rocket ships that can land on the moon. As I've said, science demands proofs for what it believes, even though those beliefs are being revised as we get better and better evidence. But there is something that scientists believe in that cannot be proved, and that's a principle I call the central doctrine of science, and that is all properties and events in the physical world are governed by laws, and those laws always hold true. And graduate students in science absorb this central doctrine through every pore of their skin. It's an unconscious but powerful commitment. And I call the central doctrine of science a doctrine because despite its great success in the past, it can't be proved. It has to be accepted as a matter of faith. No matter how lawful and logical the universe has been up to now, we can't be certain that tomorrow there might be some phenomena that is unexplained by our understanding, that is illogical or unlawful. We can't be sure. So that's why we have to have faith in the central doctrine. But our faith in the doctrine is so strong that when we find, and I say we, I mean scientists and maybe some others, our faith in the doctrine is so strong that when we find physical phenomena that can't be understood or explained in terms of current laws, we attempt to revise those laws rather than to abandon the belief in a lawful universe. In fact, I can't imagine any event that scientists would label as a miracle unexplainable by science. Even if this lectern started floating in the air, a scientist would look for wires holding it up, or maybe a magnetic levitation underneath. And even if they couldn't find any of those things, they would assume that there's some new force that we haven't yet discovered, but a lawful force, not a supernatural force. So it's a very powerful commitment that we scientists have to the belief that the physical universe is lawful. And in summarizing, I'd argue that despite the huge differences between religion and science in the way that knowledge is obtained and revised, that both share a degree of faith, a belief and commitment to the unprovable. Science experimentally tests and verifies all the things that it believes about particular phenomena, but it cannot prove the fundamental belief with the central doctrine that the universe is lawful. Well, I want to switch gears slightly back to my summers in Maine on the island. And I have a psychiatrist friend who thinks that I have nothing to do during my long summers in Maine. So he gave me a thick book titled Existential Psychotherapy. This person who wrote the book is Irvin Yalom, who's Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry at Stanford. His book is thicker and heavier than 3 of my lightweight books put together. So Professor Yalom is an acolyte of the Gestalt psychologist, and those thinkers hold that we naturally and unavoidably tend to organize all experiences into meaningful patterns. If we see a picture of random dots, we parse it into figures and background like the constellations in the night sky. If we see a broken circle, we mentally complete the circle. We humans are pattern makers. And over the years that I've been summering in Maine, I've come to realize that my main occupation there is not writing or thinking or reading, but trying to figure out whether it all adds up to anything. And a major obstacle that I've had is this, that I've always thought that for something to have meaning, it has to be permanent, or at least last a very long time. What's the point, I ask myself, of something that's here today and gone tomorrow, like a meal or a letter or a pair of shoes? And by contrast, people still discuss and perform King Lear centuries after it was written. People still gaze in awe at the paintings on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. But I'm a materialist, and as a materialist, I know that nothing lasts. Even King Lear might be forgotten in 1,000 years. Or if 1,000 years isn't long enough to satisfy your personal idea of a long time, what about 10,000 years, which is just the blink of an eye in the unfolding of the universe? Everything that I see around me right now, this beautiful church, my house, my children and their children and their children will be gone without a trace in 1,000 years. And in fact, I ask myself, does anything that we do on our modest planet, which is only one among billions of planets in our galaxy, which is only one of billions of galaxies in the observable universe, does any of that have meaning on a grand scale? Unless there exists some infinite and permanent observer, some absolute authority by which to judge and preserve meaning, then it seems to me that the situation is hopeless for finding meaning. On the other hand, maybe my starting assumption that meaning requires permanence is erroneous. Or maybe meaning itself is an illusion. I mean, after all, crows and fish get along fine without meaning. These are the kinds of unsettling thoughts that occur to me as I walk about the island in the summer. And sometimes I pose to myself the following situation, and I'd love to hear your answers during the Q&A. And I call this situation the smart ant conundrum. Imagine a colony of highly intelligent ants. And suppose that this ant colony lasts for a century, which is a very long time. It's an old colony. And over the century, these brainy ants create a great civilization. They build advanced structures underground. They compose music. They create paintings and theater. They write books and histories of their society. They develop science and theories about the cosmos, both inside the anthill and out. They have emotions and intimate relationships. And then one day, a flood comes and totally destroys the anthill. Totally. There's nothing left. No ants, no ant books, no ant paintings, nothing. Everything is completely destroyed. There's no trace left in the universe of this magnificent ant colony. So here's the question. Did the ant colony have any meaning? And now, after the colony is gone with no record of its existence, does it have any meaning? I squint my eyes and try to see Professor Yalom's patterns, and I think that I see them in the small when I watch reflected sunlight flickering on my bedroom ceiling, or when I watch hummingbirds hovering near my front porch. I think I see patterns and meaning in the moment, but not beyond. Maybe the moment is all there is. But for some reason, I and my fellow travelers are not satisfied with the moment. The now isn't enough. We want to go beyond the moment. We want to build systems and patterns and memories that connect moment to eternity. Can we mortals ever get there to eternity? And I'm reminded of some beautiful lines in an Emily Dickinson poem. Forever is composed of nows. 'Tis not a different time. And I'm afraid that I disagree with Miss Dickinson because I don't think that you can get to infinity by finite moments. You can't count to infinity with any given number of numbers. But we long to be part of that forever. Returning once again to the question that I opened with in the first clip, how do complex human experiences arise from material atoms and molecules? And the most fundamental of all human experiences is consciousness, that impossible to describe first-person feeling of I-ness, of being separate from the rest of the world around us, of self-awareness, of being able to remember the past and plan for the future, having a self. We know that our brain is composed of roughly 100 billion neurons, and each of those neurons is connected to 1,000 other neurons. So another way of phrasing the question is, how does consciousness arise from the electrical and chemical signals between neurons? In this last clip I'm going to show you, which is the last clip of the evening, I'm going to give a tentative answer to that, or at least a suggestion. And in this clip, you'll see a woman playing the cello. Her name is Zoe Keating. Maybe if some of you have heard her music before. She composed and performed all of the music in the PBS television series. So here's the last clip. Swept away by a haunting melody, falling in love, that unique first-person sensation we call consciousness. How can these extraordinary moments arise from mere matter? How can complex human experiences come from the material neurons in our brains? In recent years, scientists and others have come to recognize something we call emergent phenomena. The behavior of complex systems that's not evident in their individual parts. A good example is the way that certain groups of fireflies synchronize their flashing. When a bunch of such fireflies first find themselves together on a summer night, each insect flashes at different random times, like blinking Christmas tree lights. But after a minute or so, even without a boss firefly giving orders, all the fireflies have adjusted their bodies so that they flash on and off in synchrony. It's the same when starlings flock in what's called a murmuration. No one bird is calling the shots. No predetermined path is being followed. In fact, you could build similar behavior in a computer. Give the individual particles just a few simple rules and set things in motion. And look what happens. A digital murmuration. Such collective behavior cannot be understood by the analysis of a single bird or firefly. Another example of emergent phenomena is the magnificent structures built by termites, called termite cathedrals. The cathedrals sometimes have elaborate galleries and chimneys to control airflow, temperature, and humidity. Yet where's the master plan? Individual termites, which are blind, cannot perceive even the overall shape of the mound, much less direct its design. Similarly, our human brains, composed of 100 billion firefly-like neurons, exhibit all kinds of spectacular behavior that can't be explained or predicted in terms of individual neurons. Atoms transcending atoms, the miraculous from the material. That was the last clip, but I would like to end with a few words. And I'd like to end with a final example of spiritual materialism, this phrase that I've coined. There's very good scientific evidence that all of the atoms in our bodies, except for the two smallest atoms, hydrogen and helium, were formed and created at the centers of stars. Carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and all the other atoms in our body were formed in nuclear reactions at the centers of stars, and we have very good evidence for that. If you could tag each of the atoms in your body and follow them backwards in time through the air that you breathed during your lifetime, through all the food that you ate during your lifetime, back through the geological history of Earth, to the ancient seas and soil, back to the formation of the Earth, and then out into interstellar space. You could trace each of your atoms, those exact atoms, to particular massive stars in the sky. At the end of their lifetimes, those stars exploded and spewed out into space their newly forged atoms, which later condensed into planets and oceans and plants and your body at this moment. We've seen those stellar explosions with our telescopes and know that they occur. If instead of going backwards in time, let me go forwards in time to my personal death and beyond. The atoms in my body will remain, only they will be scattered about. Those atoms won't know where they came from, but they will have been mine. Some of those atoms will once have been part of the memory of my mother dancing the bossa nova. Some of those atoms will once have been part of the smell, the vinegary smell of my first apartment. Some of those atoms will be from this hand right here. And if I could label each of my atoms right now, imprint each with my social security number, someone could follow those atoms, those particular atoms, for the next 1,000 years as they floated in air, mixed with the soil, became parts of particular plants and trees, dissolved in the ocean and then floated in the air again. And some of my atoms will undoubtedly become parts of people, particular people. So we're literally connected to the stars in the past, and we're literally connected to future generations of people. And in this way, even in a material universe, we're connected to all things, future and past. Thank you. Should I close the laptop? Close it? Okay. I'll be happy to take questions. Yes, over here.
You got a microphone coming down. Stand by.
Thank you very much. There is a psychological term I understand called shattering of the ego, where people look at the stars or the mountains or the oceans and realize that those other objects have been here for millions of years and we haven't. Is that what your experience in the boat was like, where you went from materialistic to realizing that there's actually something a lot more out there than just atoms and hydrogen and carbon atoms?
Well, I think that everything out there is atoms, but the thing that I felt was a connection to all of that. And it's that feeling of connectedness that I was trying to talk about.
Is that God, theoretically?
It might be. I'm somewhere between, I'm close to an agnostic, but I think that everyone can individually form their own opinion about what that is. And I'm certainly not going to tell other people what to believe, but I think we've all had experiences where we feel connected to things larger than ourselves.
Microphone. I love your work. I am just honored to be here. Thank you. I was thinking about I grew up on a lake where there were geese, and when I was in second grade, I started wondering, what is it that makes all of those geese take off at the same moment? And I started thinking, I came across collective consciousness. And is that something that, is there a bridge between the physical world and the world of consciousness there, do you think? Maybe?
Well, I think all of the geese taking off at the same time could be an example of the emergent phenomena that I was talking about at the end.
Is that collective consciousness?
Is that connected to consciousness?
No, collective.
Collective consciousness. Well, it depends what you mean by collective consciousness. If you mean some kind of paranormal, you don't mean that. Well, you could call it collective consciousness. I mean, is it collective consciousness when 100,000 termites build a termite cathedral? It's certainly a situation where the whole is acting in a way that is not found in the individual parts, where the individual parts are working together to create something qualitatively new. And you can call that collective consciousness. It's collective something.
Yes.
I was just going to go back to your question about the ant colony.
Yeah. You have an answer to that?
I have another question because you said, does it matter? Is that what you ended with? You asked, what was your question?
Does it have a meaning? Yeah,
does
what
it
is
have
the meaning?
meaning? And I would bounce back and say, to whom? And then sort of kind of circle around to, if the answer is humans, then we're left with, in my mind, the hubris of not being connected to the other.
It's a good comment. Well, when you say to whom, I think you need an intelligence to be the recipient of that whom, to be some intelligence. I think I mentioned very briefly that physicists believe that there might be many other universes besides ours, and evidently, although we don't know for sure, we do know that the conditions necessary for life to form in a universe are very special, and so we think that in most of the other universes, if they exist, life probably doesn't exist. And so you can ask the question, what is the significance of life or intelligent life in a universe? And my answer to that question, which I think is related to the comment you made, is that without intelligent life, there's no observer of what happens in the universe. That we intelligent beings, and I'm sure there are other intelligent beings out there in outer space, I mean, almost certainly there are, and I know that life in general, even in our universe, is a very tiny fraction of all the material in the universe. About 1/billionth of 1/billionth is in living form. That we living beings, and especially we intelligent living beings, are the only way that the universe can comment on itself. We are the spectators of this grand spectacle out there. And if there's no observer, can you say that a waterfall is beautiful or that a sunset is beautiful? I think that those judgments require a mind of some kind. And I think it's related to your comment about to whom does the anthill have meaning?
But you ascribe no intentionality to the ants.
Oh, I think these intelligent ants had intentionality for sure. I mean, I don't think you can write a symphony without intentionality.
Smart ants.
Yes.
It's fascinating to me that you, as a scientist, knew all these things about the universe, all these facts about the universe. So that wasn't news to you as you lay there in that boat that night. But what seems something happened in the way I hear you talk about it, it's as if all of these things, something spoke to you. It addressed you. And not only addressed you, but you responded. I mean, how many of us look up at the sky and nothing speaks to us? But for some reason that night, there was a vulnerability, there was a receptivity, there was a humility, there was a whole lot of things that came together in that moment that involved a call of some sort and a response from you, and it resulted in a kind of transformation. And this relates to what a sociologist in Germany calls resonance. Resonance from music, that this is the experience of resonance, which he says is at the central sort of, it is integral to the nature of the human being, these experiences that we have. It's not accidental, even though we never control it either. It's completely beyond our control. So it's interesting to me that what I guess I'm saying is that your experience was not perhaps in spite of being a scientist, but because you were a scientist.
Well, that's a good question. Well, I want to distinguish between science and scientists. So science takes a fully reductionist view of the world. And everything can be broken into smaller parts, which can be broken into smaller parts, and eventually you have something which is like a pendulum swinging back and forth on a string. And I think that scientists are human beings, and we have complicated human experiences. And even though I think that ultimately every mental experience we have resides in the neurons of our brains, I don't think that we can fully understand the experiences in a reductionist manner. And it might sound like that's doublespeak, that I'm trying to have it both ways, but that's really what I believe. That I think that the reductionist method of science has limitations. And I think science is a blunt instrument for trying to understand some of the complicated feelings that we have, even though I think that those feelings happen in the material brain, and the material brain is made out of neurons, which are made of atoms and molecules. So it does sound like I'm trying to have it both ways, but that's really what I think science has limitations. And I'm kind of glad that it does. There's a part of the first episode that I didn't show you, the first episode of the television series, where I asked a number of scientists, each one at a time, if you could push a button and have the answer to the most profound question in your field. You know, for a biologist, it might be, how did life begin on Earth? For a physicist, it might be, how did the universe begin, or something like that. If you could push the button, would you do it, to have the answer to the most profound question in your field? Half of the scientists said, I would push the button, and half of them said, I wouldn't push the button. And the ones who said that they wouldn't push the button, they justified that response by saying that the scientific endeavor, the journey, is just as important as the end. And it reminds me of something that Albert Einstein said, which I think is relevant here. He said that the most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion that lies at the cradle of true art and true science. So I can't do better than Einstein it's stating my belief about all of this.
So I'd like to suggest there's another reason why it was so hard for you, or for all of us, to have that experience of oneness with the stars, and I would suggest that it's our culture. That we have been raised in a culture that is separate from nature and sees ourselves as above nature, because the Native Americans have a very different kind of culture, as we know, so do the ancient Chinese. And they're very much able to see that there isn't a difference, that there is this eternal, astonishing interconnectedness. And I would also suggest that our culture is at because of our cultural blindness, we're at great risk for being able to make the kinds of decisions we need to make about the future of our planet and the future of life. And if you have any suggestions about how we can speed this up so that more of us can lie in the bottom of a boat and understand that interconnectedness.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the relationship that we have with nature and with many other things is cultural, and that let's take China, for example, that people are much more integrated with nature, going back to Confucius. But science developed in the West, not in Asia. And so there is something to be said for the reductionist way of thinking, from being able to put the experiment in this self-contained box, and I'm out here looking at the experiment. That perspective is what allowed the development of science, and it developed in the West. Now, I think that the Asian view has great value, and I agree with everything you said. But I just wanted to add a footnote to what you said.
I think that you're right about having it both ways. I think that it's not I think it's not either or. I think we don't have the words for the connections or the way to measure them. I think we need to be able to hold contradictory thoughts in our head at the same time and have faith that both are true and find our own kind of connection between them.
Good comment.
Hi. First of all, I'm such a huge fan. I brought my super old copy of Einstein's Dreams, the book that brought my husband and I together, so thank you.
Thank you.
So my question is, how much of the universe is dark matter? About.
Okay, how much of the universe is dark matter? Well, we actually have a pretty good estimate of that. It's something like 25%. Normal matter, which is the matter that produces light, like stars, that's only about 5%. And then there's matter that we know is there because we can see as gravitational effects, which is about 20% or so. And then there's another 75% that we call dark energy, which we only discovered 25 years ago. And this is a very strange form of material that acts like an anti-gravitational force. It makes things accelerate away from each other instead of pull towards each other like normal gravity. And we don't really know what the dark energy is, but it's the dominant form of matter energy in the universe. So there's still a lot that we don't know, which is great.
Right. When I learned some of what you just said, a little tiny bit of it, a number of years ago, for me, that was a sort of spiritual moment for me to say, spiritual in the way they think that you're talking about, which is that maybe it's not that it's supernatural, but it's beyond comprehension at this moment, beyond understanding at this moment. And there may be a scientific a reality there, or kind of a reductionist or a materialist, but we don't know what that is. It's beyond us.
Yeah.
And to me, that was inspiring.
Yeah, well, there's a fundamental philosophical question here, which is whether there is knowledge that we don't know now, but ultimately we think we will learn, versus knowledge that we think in principle we will never learn. And I'm reminded of Milton's Paradise Lost, where the Gabriel Adam is beginning to ask questions to the Archangel Gabriel about how the planets move, and is the Earth the center, is the Sun the center? And the Archangel says, there's some things which are only to be known by God and are not in your province. And so there is a view of some people that there are areas of knowledge which even in principle human beings will never learn. So there's sort of two different views there.
We have time for one last question before we move over to the book signing through the door over here. We'll take one last question.
You call this spiritual materialism. I'm curious what you think materials.
Can you raise your hand? I can't see.
Right here. I'm going to stand up.
Okay. Yeah.
You call it spiritual materialism. I'm curious what you think material spiritualism would look like.
Well, you could call it spiritual materialism. Or material spiritualism, you could call it that. I think they're both, I think you could define them to be the same thing. I like the rhythm of the phrase spiritual materialism more.